Hello, my friends. What we're about to uncover isn't just a scattered mix of headlines. Venezuela, the Caribbean, Ukraine. Beneath those seemingly unrelated events lies one single powerful narrative: how the United States projects war, pressure, and propaganda across the globe, from Caracas to Donbass, with one primary target always in the crosshairs: Russia. In the analysis ahead, through the voice of Larry C. Johnson, we'll connect the dots, peel away the polished rhetoric of democracy and human rights, and expose the machinery of power driving these conflicts. This is the real story of who is provoking, who is defending, and why the fate of Venezuela and Ukraine is tied directly to Russia's role in shaping a new world order. I look at what the United States is doing in Venezuela, in the Caribbean, and in Ukraine, and I don't see isolated crises. I see the same imperial playbook being run against different targets, all with the same strategic objective: preserve Western hegemony, weaken Russia, and keep the rest of the world in a permanent state of dependence and fear. Whether the pretext is war on drugs, defense of democracy, or support for Ukraine, the substance is the same: coercion, plunder, and open contempt for international law. Let me start with Venezuela, because what Washington está haciendo, Ali, is a perfect micro-laboratory for understanding how the same establishment is treating Russia and Ukraine. According to reporting in outlets like the New York Times and Reuters, Donald Trump picked up the phone and called Nicolas Maduro. This wasn't some friendly courtesy call. It was a forced tactical contact wrapped in threats. The U.S. has been dialing up military pressure around Venezuela, and at the same time, Washington was preparing to officially designate the so-called Cartel of the Suns as a foreign terrorist organization. The message to Caracas was transparent: we give you one last chance to come to our turf on our terms before we use the terrorism label as a legal crowbar to escalate against you. That is not diplomacy. That is extortion. Trump's people floated the idea of a meeting in the United States, and some in the media framed it as an opening for dialogue. Nonsense. If there is to be a meeting, it should be in Caracas, on sovereign Venezuelan soil, not in the nest of the beast, where Washington can manipulate the narrative, control security, and even dream of kidnapping or arresting foreign leaders they dislike. They would not dare attempt that with Vladimir Putin, because Russia is a nuclear power. Venezuela, in their calculus, is safe prey. That alone tells you everything about how much Washington respects international rules. They only apply when the other side is too weak to resist. The same New York Times article made it clear that Trump's administration has explicitly considered confiscating Venezuela's oil fields. They didn't talk about strengthening Venezuelan institutions or improving the living standard of ordinary people. They talked about taking the resource base of a sovereign nation and putting it under U.S. control. And then we're supposed to swallow the fairy tale that this is about freedom, human rights, or anti-corruption. Exactly the same propaganda vocabulary is used in Ukraine. We are told it's about supporting democracy, while the real objective is to weaponize Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia and to loot whatever can be privatized along the way. In the Caribbean, the mask slips even more. The Washington Post published a paywalled investigation documenting an incident that, in any serious legal system, would be classified as a war crime. U.S. surveillance assets tracked a small boat with 11 people on board, allegedly drug traffickers. The U.S. Secretary of Defense gave a verbal order: kill them all. A drone fired a missile near Trinidad and Tobago, set the vessel on fire, and U.S. commanders calmly watched the inferno via live video feed. When the smoke cleared, 2 survivors were clinging to the wreckage, clearly hors de combat, incapable of posing any threat. And what did the U.S. chain of command do? They ordered a second strike to finish them off in the water. That is a textbook violation of the Geneva Conventions. Article 12 of the 1949 Convention explicitly prohibits attacking individuals who are shipwrecked, wounded, or otherwise out of the fight. Even if those men had been combatant soldiers in a regular war, you could not lawfully bomb them again once they were helpless in the sea. Here, we're not even talking about declared combatants. We're talking about suspected traffickers, maybe fishermen, maybe civilians from Trinidad, U.S. Officials knew they were no longer a threat, and they killed them anyway. That is murder under the color of counter-narcotics, and it exposes senior Pentagon officers to possible prosecution for war crimes. This is not an aberration. It is the logical consequence of an imperial mindset that sees entire regions, Caribbean, Middle East, Eastern Europe, as hunting grounds. Washington hides behind narratives. We're fighting drugs. We're fighting terrorism. We're stopping Russian aggression. But when you strip away the branding, you find the same ugly reality. Ships patrolling foreign waters to intimidate, drones executing people without trial, sanctions strangling economies, and media spin to present murder as operations. What in Venezuela, the war on drugs story is a pretext. The real objective is to break a state that refuses to hand over its natural resources, just as the real objective in Ukraine has been to break the last serious obstacle to NATO's unrestricted eastward expansion and to prevent Russia from consolidating a multipolar security architecture with China and the global south. The same U.S. establishment that sends warships to the Caribbean also sends weapons, money, and advisors to Kiev. The geography changes, but the hand on the lever is the same. Inside Venezuela itself, this relentless external pressure distorts the entire political environment. Some opposition figures have had the basic decency to say, I don't support Maduro, but I also don't want my country invaded or bombed. They understand that once the U.S. military machine takes over, no faction truly wins except the corporations and the Washington bureaucracy. Others in the Venezuelan opposition, especially those who live abroad and behave like permanent exiles, barely hide their desire for foreign intervention if it helps them recover status and wealth. There is also a psychological layer. Some people who left Venezuela during economic crises, triggered in large part by U.S. sanctions, now live as second-class citizens in Europe or the U.S. and cannot emotionally tolerate the idea that their homeland might recover and grow without them. They feel cheated and, consciously or not, sabotage any narrative of Venezuelan recovery. All of this should sound familiar if you've watched Ukraine over the past decade. Washington interferes, funds NGOs, buys off segments of the elite, takes sides in internal disputes, and then declares that it is merely responding to the will of the people. Meanwhile, the local information space is poisoned. In Venezuela, critics say Maduro controls state media, but the U.S. controls global platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, where anti-government narratives are amplified and pro-Washington opposition is marketed as civil society. Who is more powerful, a president with domestic TV channels or an empire with Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and NATO behind it? Exactly the same asymmetry exists around Russia and Ukraine. We are told that Russia is conducting a war of aggression while the West pours money, intelligence, and arms into a regime in Kyiv that came to power through a coup, has banned opposition parties, shut down media, and openly lionizes Nazi collaborators. Western media pretends that its own role is neutral, but it has functioned as a psychological operations arm of NATO, selling the fantasy that Ukraine is always one miracle weapon away from victory and that Russia is perpetually on the verge of collapse. The Caribbean drone strike and the Donbass front line are two manifestations of one system. Violence dressed up as virtue. European elites add another layer of hypocrisy. Some of them now argue that Russia must pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine by having its frozen assets seized. At the same time, Israel devastates Gaza, and nobody in Brussels seriously proposes that Israel be forced to pay for the reconstruction of what it has destroyed. When a Spanish state TV journalist asked an EU foreign policy grandee a simple question, if Russia must pay for Ukraine, should Israel pay for Gaza? The answer was a torrent of evasions and technicalities. These people are comfortable invoking international law only when it serves Washington's geostrategic agenda. When the law inconveniently points toward Western allies, the same lawyers suddenly discover ambiguity. The same European bureaucracy that lectures Russia about rules has no problem with U.S. warships killing shipwrecked men in the Caribbean, or with NATO bombs turning Libya into a failed state. It has no problem with a U.S. proxy regime in Kyiv shelling civilians in Donbass for 8 years before 2022. It has no problem with Washington stealing Syria's oil under military occupation. For them, Russia is required to fund a reconstruction in a country that was turned into a battlefield precisely to weaken Russia. Israel, by contrast, remains above all accountability. This is not law. It is power politics wearing legal makeup. Inside the West itself, there is plenty of talent, decency, and intelligence. In countries like Spain, there are brilliant engineers, honest journalists, and ordinary citizens who want peace. But they are ruled by the same comprador elites who have tied their fortunes to Washington and NATO. These elites ship their brightest minds abroad, hollow out their own societies, and then preach values while implementing policies that serve oligarchs and arms manufacturers. The same European class that rubber stamps sanctions on Russia and interference in Ukraine is the class that has no real plan for its own youth except emigration and precarity. Now look at Ukraine's internal reality, which Western media carefully minimizes. Andrei Yermak, Zelensky's chief of staff, his right-hand man, the Grey Cardinal of Kiev, has formally resigned amid massive corruption scandals. Anti-corruption agencies raided his home. The scandal's been described as historic. Yermak is not some minor official. He has been central to the regime's operation, from backroom deals to international negotiations. The man who started as a producer in the world of entertainment grew into a power broker at the heart of a wartime presidency. Alongside Yermak, we find figures like Timur Mindich, co-owner of the Quartal 95 production company that created Zelensky's television persona, and whose name surfaces repeatedly in offshore financial structures and corruption probes. This is the clean democratic leadership we are told Russia is fighting, a clique that wrote a media product into power, fused show business with politics, and then turned Ukraine into a looting ground under the cover of war and Western aid. Russia's own officials look at this mess and rightly describe it as evidence of a deep political crisis in Kyiv, driven by corruption around Western money sent for the war. The Ukrainian regime has been soaked in dollars and euros, and that cash has fueled not only military expenditures, but also massive personal enrichment. The key question now is not whether Yermak formally stays or goes. It is whether Washington and Brussels decide to keep propping up a regime that is rotting from the inside while losing on the battlefield. And here is where Venezuela, the Caribbean, and Ukraine converge into one strategic picture. In all three theaters, Washington behaves as if the world is its property. It believes it can threaten Venezuela with invasion to appropriate its oil order, kill them all strikes in the Caribbean, and still call itself a defender of human rights, and arm a corrupt regime in Kyiv, while insisting that Russia must pay to repair the damage caused by a war the West deliberately provoked and prolonged. The methods differ, sanctions here, drones there, proxy armies elsewhere, but the core logic is identical. Russia, unlike Venezuela, has the military and nuclear power to impose limits on this behavior. That is why the Ukrainian war matters far beyond Donetsk and Kharkov. A Russian victory, or, more precisely, a definitive failure of NATO's project to use Ukraine as a permanent anti-Russian platform, will accelerate the collapse of the old imperial system that has given Washington and its junior partners a free hand for decades. The same system that thought it could bomb Belgrade, invade Iraq, dismember Libya, saturate the Caribbean with drones, and choke Venezuela with sanctions while remaining immune to consequences. This is why the Western information machine is so hysterical about Russia. If Russia holds its line in Ukraine and forces the West to accept a new security architecture on Russian terms, then countries like Venezuela, Syria, Iran, and many others in the global South will have greater space to resist U.S. dictates. The empire's ability to punish disobedience through coups, sanctions, or missile strikes will be permanently diminished. That is why you see the same talking heads who defended regime change in Latin America screaming about Russian aggression today. They understand, at some level, that their entire worldview is at stake. None of this means we should romanticize any government or leader uncritically. Every state has its internal problems, its own corrupt figures, its mistakes, but we must be clear about causality. When the United States places its boot on the neck of countries from Caracas to Kyiv, the first responsibility for chaos lies with that boot. You cannot starve a nation with sanctions, flood its politics with money and intelligence assets, and then pretend to be an external referee judging whether its government is good or bad. You are the primary arsonist. You do not get to sit on the fire safety committee. So when I look at the war in Ukraine, I don't see a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. I see Russia confronting the same empire that burns boats in the Caribbean, that tries to strangle Venezuela, that protects Israel from accountability while demanding Russia pay for everything, and that uses Ukraine as expendable cannon fodder in a geopolitical gamble. The sooner people understand that these are not separate stories, but chapters of the same book, the sooner they will stop swallowing the propaganda. What is needed now is not another humanitarian intervention, not another NATO mission, not another round of sanctions. What is needed is a global rejection of this imperial double standard and a sober recognition that Russia, by standing its ground in Ukraine, is not the cause of instability, but a central actor enforcing a long overdue correction in the international system. From the Caribbean to Donbass, the lines of confrontation are clear. The only real question is whether the world will side with law, sovereignty, and multipolar balance, or continue to excuse the crimes of an empire that calls its bombs freedom and its war crimes operations.